Hi everyone, I'm Katie Miranda. I'm here today with Phil Weiss of Mondo Weiss. I'm interviewing him for the Palestine Solidarity Telesummit. Phil is a journalist and the founder and co-editor of the news website Mondo Weiss. Now, Phil and I are having a contest, and you're going to have to wait until the end of the interview to find out how to enter. But we are going to be giving away 8 copies of Ali Abunimah's book, The Battle of Justice in Palestine. And I'm going to announce how to enter the contest at the end of the interview. So, Phil, we're going to jump right in now.
Okay.
You were a former employee of Jared Kushner. And I'm not sure if everybody watching this series knows that, but I read an article on Mondo Weiss that you wrote about that, and I found it really interesting and definitely relevant to our times. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and maybe some insight into his current behavior that you have?
Well, I'm not sure about insight into his current behavior. I can tell you that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, this website started as a blog at the New York Observer, and Jared Kushner bought the New York Observer in that year, 2006, and I thought that was the death knell for this blog, inasmuch as at that point I had already it began as a personal blog, but I was addressing political questions, and I was questioning Zionism as a Jew. And in 2006, in fact, I went to Israel and Palestine for the first time on Jared Kushner's nickel. I wanted to go out and see, it was during the Lebanon War. I went out and covered that war, and I saw apartheid before my eyes in the West Bank. And Jared Kushner was very disturbed by my writings about Israel. My editor at the time said, Jared's a Zionist, I'm a Zionist, he was saying of himself. The publisher's a Zionist. Everyone who ran that paper was a Zionist. And I was stating beliefs that were a heresy to them. It wasn't an idle conviction on their question. It wasn't that if I had been against abortion rights, or if I had been an anti-feminist, or if I had been a pro-Second Amendment person, it would not have cut to the bone in the way that Zionism and anti-Zionism did. And so a year after this website began, Jared Kushner gave it the axe. I had to leave the Observer. I met him only 2 or 3 times, 3 or 4 times, I'd say, during that year that I was, quote unquote, working for him. And he was very young at that point. He was 26. He's still pretty young. But he had the one thing I would say that speaks to his experience, his actions today, is that, as my editor put it, he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He wasn't someone who went to others and said, I really don't know what's going on here. I sort of want to understand, help me to understand. He entered journalism without having any background in journalism and was sure in this sort of arrogant fashion that he could run a newspaper. And in a similar fashion, I think that he's approached the quote unquote peace process, which of course has been a charade for Palestinians for a quarter century, and decided, well, I can do this right, and I can get a peace deal here, or I can, me and my father-in-law can get a peace deal here. I think there's a lot of arrogance in his approach, and typically he's reflecting the Jewish and Zionist and Israeli experience in his remarks so far. He doesn't seem to give much of a care for the Palestinian story and the Palestinian conditions, which I tried to acquaint him with 12 years ago.
And what
got
happened?
Fired for doing.
Okay, you got fired. That's what happened.
Yes, sorry. Fired.
Wow.
Simple word, yeah. Count on a journalist to make a story too complicated. He fired me.
Yeah.
In 2007.
So, Phil, you've done a lot of work on the ground in Palestine, a lot of journalism in Palestine and Israel. What resistance tactics have you noticed seem to be working on the ground in Palestine?
Well, I think that a lot is working right now on the part of Palestinian resistance. It doesn't seem that way, I don't think, to Palestinians over there because things just keep getting worse or bumping along the bottom or, another massacre in Gaza. We have 170 people killed this spring and summer, exercising, most of them, almost all of them, nonviolent protesters. And so it seems rather bleak over there, but I think it's working in that the discussion is shifting and that slowly but surely this argument between Palestinians and Israelis that has been the Israel-Palestine conflict is morphing into what it should be, which is a more global discussion. And so the fact that the British Labour Party is now under fire for supporting Palestinian rights, that's the way it should be. This should be discussed in the imperial salons, chambers, courts, because Israel could not exist without support from the Western world. And so I feel that Palestinians, with the help of Israel, are in this chapter, are delegitimizing the state of Israel and bringing it to an international forum. I remember that George Antonius, one of the first great Palestinian nationalists and writers, journalists, said 80 years ago or 70 years ago, I just need to get this to an international forum and people will understand how unfair this is. And he failed. Palestinians have failed in that respect for 70 years, and not for lack of trying, but because they're up against a fearsome opposition and Israel lobby and Israel's friends and Zionists worldwide. Well, that is what is changing now, and I ascribe that a lot to Palestinian resistance. So to be specific, just to be specific for a moment, I mean, what Ahed Tamimi did, which was so brave, has electrified the world. And what the Gaza demonstrators have done, which is so incredibly brave, has also animated the left-wing world. And I think that's vital.
You've done a lot of work within the Jewish community in the United States. And can you tell us what's going on in organizing in the Jewish community and what's working in that regard?
Well, I think that, again, I'm very hopeful. I'm an optimistic person. And what I see today in the Jewish community is a crisis over Zionism. And young people, young Jews are saying, we don't like this. If this is Jewish, this is not Jewish, in our view, to be supporting the state of Israel. So that is the very hopeful thing that I see happening inside the Jewish community, that anti-Zionism and non-Zionism are becoming legitimate stances within the Jewish community, thanks in large part to the alienation of young Jews. I mean, I've worked somewhat within the Jewish community for the last 10, 12 years, one foot in the Jewish community, one foot in a wider left-wing community, and also a American interest community. I've worked with any groups that have supported Palestinian human rights. But I come from a Jewish community. I care about the Jewish community. I want it to reform itself. And the great hope now is among young Jews who are refusing to accept Israel, an apartheid state, as part of their inheritance.
That's something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of in the politics in the United States. And on the one hand, it's very hopeful, but on the other hand, I'm sort of afraid that it's going to take several generations, basically, for the people in power right now to die out and then be replaced by these young people who actually, refuse to accept Zionism as part of Judaism. And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that's what it's going to have to take?
I don't agree. I mean, maybe because I'm just more optimistic. And also, I should say that, we are not addressing here the issue of Jewish privilege, which obviously is a large factor here. Why is it that the opinions of 2% of the population or 2.5% or whatever Jews constitute should be so determinative of U.S. policy? Well, we can get into that, but I don't think you're right because I think that politics in the United States are more dynamic than that, and left-wing politics have shown themselves to be more dynamic. And so, if you look at the Me Too uh, revolution, if you look at the Black Lives Matter, hasn't been a revolution, but it certainly has been a very important movement in left-wing life. And I think social media has helped to transform the landscape. And I think that ultimately the Israel-Palestine issue will become, excuse the expression, sort of viral. And also there are going to be some crises, as we see in England right now with this battle over Corbyn and, what he said and, how bad a man he is just for supporting Palestinian rights. It's going to happen here. We're seeing several Congress people who are running in the Democratic Party who are inevitably, who are presumptively, there are districts that they're going to be elected in November. And these are Congress people who support Palestinian human rights. I think we're getting to a high watermark in terms of support for Palestine. And it's just going to keep going. So I, again, am... that disturbs me to think it'll take generations. You could be right.
I hope I'm
you
not
could be right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes.
So what tactics do you think are not working in either on the ground in Palestine or coming from the international community, and people should stop doing them? Like, for example, something that's wasting a ton of money and effort and resources and not producing any results. Is there anything like that?
I'm not an activist, I'm a journalist, and I'm not that acquainted. I sort of avoid left-wing activist circles because, activists are activists and they're always the most intense and engaged, and it's not a good place to be a journalist as such, to listen to their discussions, because you can't really report on, they don't want you reporting on it. And I'm basically on their side. I am on their side, but I can't really report on. So I'm sorry. It's a long way of saying I don't really know I don't like a lot of the sectarian activist arguments. I don't think they do a lot of good, but it's the nature of activism that there are going to be a lot of splits and factional disputes. I think that takes up too much energy, but I'm sure that happened during abolition times back in the 1850s, and ultimately you don't know who is going to be in the coalition. The coalition to end slavery was ultimately a very broad one, and people who had said, well, no, we're not trying to end slavery. No, 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 no. The Republican Party and Lincoln, they came on board and they said, here's the Emancipation Proclamation. We're abolishing slavery. So these things can shift very rapidly, but they involve building a broad coalition. And I guess the one thing I would fault is too much sectarianism and narrow coalition building. I'm not an organizer. I'm a journalist, but I think that ultimately liberal Zionists, we're going to need some of them. They're going to have to give up their Zionism in the end. But I don't think there's going to be a two-state solution. There are some ways in which I might have supported a two-state solution, but just as a peaceful end. But right now, the two-state solution is this horrible charade that has deluded Palestinians and created false hope for 25 years. There's a cruelty about even suggesting that it's alive. And I guess I think that ultimately liberal Zionists will have to accept two great American principles: equality of all human beings and separation of church and state. And I think that's going to happen, but I think that part of that is our messaging. And Uh, I do a lot of slamming on liberal Zionists, but sometimes you gotta be a little nice to them, I guess. So I try. I have mixed messages on that. I can't tell people how to organize that. But I think part of our job is to win a broader coalition.
What do you think it is about liberal Zionists who are liberal on all these other issues that you and I probably agree with them about, but then they're illiberal on the issue of Palestine? What do you think is actually going on in their head about that?
I think it's a historical psychosis that
Because it's
springs from
not
the
it's not that they don't know anymore. They don't have that excuse, right?
oh yeah, they don't, but they can rationalize that by saying, well, Israel can reform itself. Israel can reform. They
Mm-hmm.
will continue to believe that Israel will reform itself, and we're around the corner from someone defeating Netanyahu. Uh, if Netanyahu's the problem, and he's like Trump. He's got this lock on the highest office, political office in the land because coalitions, and we just have to defeat him, and everything's going to be fine. Uh, they're deluding themselves, I believe. But I think that the attachment of liberal Zionists to essentially a racist program, which is Zionism, is a historical psychosis that comes out of the Holocaust. I have a great deal of understanding for this because I grew up in the Jewish community, and I share a historical understanding of what an important episode of history the Holocaust was. But at this point, there are many other people who have experienced genocides. There are people who have experienced persecution. Right now, Jews are doing very well in the United States, and we should be thinking about who is being persecuted right now. And it ain't Jews, it's Palestinians, and we are enabling it. And that contradiction has to overcome the historical self-involvement in our own history and persecution, speaking as a Jew.
And have you seen, I mean, with your work in the Jewish community, you must have seen a lot of people turn over. Do you think it was because they've been reading your articles on Weiss, or like what is it that makes them change?
I wouldn't say that I have that effect. I seek to have that effect. I think I'm got a little too much anger about it all to have that, even though I'm 63. I would say that the best thing is when they go over there and they see for
Mm,
themselves. That is just enormously important. You walk a mile in a Palestinian's shoes, and it changes your life. That's my view of the situation. Just go walk a mile, walk half a mile, walk the 150 feet through Calandia checkpoint, you know? And if you're not transformed by that, I don't want to hear your opinion about anything. Uh, you've seen Calandia. It's just one of the most frightening edifices in the so-called democratic world, that you would spend so many millions of dollars to make one race go through cattle chutes and be humiliated and be kept from going to Jerusalem,
yeah.
a place of great holiness to your people. It is so sick. And that is a Jewish achievement, sadly. It's American establishment Jewish organizations have prevented any criticism of that because they're so wed to Zionism. So I think that, as you see, I get extremely upset about this, as any human being ought to get upset. But I think that when well-meaning Jews go over and go into the West Bank and East Jerusalem, I think it's over, frankly. I mean, it's so blatant.
But how do you get them to actually go over there? Because for a lot of Jews, including myself, who grew up in a Jewish family, we're told that Palestinians want to kill us, and certainly once they go over to Israel, they're going to have Israelis telling them, "Well, if you go into the West Bank, they'll kill you." So, what makes them decide to take that plunge?
That's a good point. I think that statistically you are correct in that the number of Jews who have been in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is not that large as a gross number. And I think that what is essential, as we're talking, I realize I'm focusing. I'm sorry that I wasn't more focused in this regard. I think that what is essential is to get the Palestinian voice to Americans. Mm-hmm. And that is something that you and I can be very proud about our efforts. We have not been, embraced by the mainstream for that. We've each paid a price for that, as do many people that we work with have paid a grotesque price for this, for simply desiring that Palestinian voices be heard. And yet we are winning, because I think that is beginning to happen. And the mainstream media is still redlining and censoring Palestinian voices, but less and less effectively. And so you see Raja Shehadeh in the New York Times reviewing Yossi Klein Halevi's really disgracefully selfish book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbors. You see Syed Kashua on the op-ed page of the New York Times expressing horror at the nation-state law. You see Yusuf Munayr in the New Yorker describing apartheid. I think that these are new developments, and I think that we are part of that change, and we are part of this insistence that Palestinians be heard. And God knows Palestinians have gotten more and more sophisticated about their message, and God bless them. You see these organizations like IMEU and U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights that are just hugely sophisticated and mature organizations that are helping to change our discourse. It's a battle, but they are helping to do it. And Jewish Voice for Peace, too, let me say.
Yeah. You mentioned in our earlier conversation about something about McCarthyism. You want to talk about that in this community? Well,
I mean, there is still, as we see in the debate about labor in England, in the United Kingdom, you speak up for Palestinian rights and you get marginalized, you get called an anti-Semite, you get written out of mainstream employment. I lost 2 jobs doing what I'm doing. I'm proud of that now. I lost one at the Nation Institute in addition to the New York Observer. And, that's the price, in any age, you want to stand by your principles, you're going to pay a price. And, but there does tend to be a monolithic response on these questions. And the idea that Palestinian human rights is important, and that denying Palestinian human rights is a form of racism is not in our media yet. We have this very fine calibration for what is anti-Semitic. Was Jeremy Corbyn anti-Semitic when he said that British Zionists don't understand British irony? People are willing to parse that a long way, but when a politician refuses to acknowledge the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, when organizations essentially say that, and when media essentially endorse a narrative that this was a land without a people for a people without a land, and don't understand the enormous price that Palestinians paid again and again for the establishment and maintenance of a Jewish state, that's racism. And I'm not one who likes to throw the racist word around. I don't think it achieves a lot when you call people racist, but there is so much bigotry against Palestinians in our media, and that's something we have to work against.
And
that's the McCarthyist element. When McCarthy was anti-communist and you called somebody a communist and you ruined their life, now you call someone pro-Palestinian and you ruin their life potentially. But we're trying to change that. McCarthyism didn't last forever. These are moods. These are moods.
Yeah, there's no kind of standard for anti-Palestinian rhetoric in the
No,
mainstream media. Nobody
no,
gets called out for that. It's
no.
just spewed left and right, and like nothing's wrong with it. And you substitute the word Jew for Palestinian into what some of these people say, and they would totally be called out for
I
it.
agree with you. I agree with you, including characterizations of the refugees in Gaza who are doing this great march of return. I mean, to characterize as terrorism the desire to return to lands from which you were ethnically cleansed. I mean, that that does not pass. When we talk about refugees to the United States now, you're not allowed to. I mean, in good liberal discourse, you can't smear them and slime them. You certainly can when it comes to Palestinians.
Yeah,
So
it's really strange how that's still legitimate, given
it is.
all that we've been through in this country in terms of race and refugees and Islamophobia. Yet it's still okay to get on CNN and talk about Palestinian terrorism when they're nonviolently marching.
Yes, astonishing, astonishing. And also, I mean, for these people not to understand that, have some understanding of why 20-year-old young men are, you know, obviously willing to, die for a cause, and it's not to hurt people. It's to stand up for their rights. I mean, that awareness should be through all our media now. We have it on Mondo Weiss on a regular basis, of which I'm proud of, but I think some people are beginning to catch a clue in the mainstream media. This has been a very important moment, the Great March.
Okay, so we are about out of time now, Phil, and I
Okay,
want to move into talking about our contest, which I promised
I'm
at the
excited.
beginning
I'm really
of
excited.
this interview. So, if you would like to win one of 8 copies of Ali Abunimah's book, The Battle of Justice in Palestine, here's what you have to do. Go on to Instagram and follow my account, Katie Miranda Jewelry, and also follow the account Mondo Weiss. Comment on the most recent post. Just say that you want a copy of Ali Abunimah's book and tag 3 friends. That's both on my
Wow.
Instagram and on Mondo Weiss. And we will pick 8 winners and we will ship you out a copy of that book.
Great. That sounds fantastic. That's a great idea. I like that book a lot. It's exciting. Ali Abunimah is an exciting and important speaker and figure, and you'll learn a lot from that book.
Okay,
So good luck.
great. Thanks so much, Phil, for this offer of sending out those books.
My pleasure. I'll be mailing them personally.
Okay, great. And thank you for the interview.